In this lecture, I'm going to try to break down the process of photosynthesis. So we've been talking about photosynthesis for the last week or so, and we've talked about, why it happens, right? Why does it happen? Well, it happens because plants do not have legs. And because plants don't have legs, they cannot go out and seek food. They need to be able to just produce food. And they do that through this very complex process called photosynthesis. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail on the inner workings of what is going on. If you go on to take some more science courses in your career as a student, you will probably go a little deeper into this depending on, at what level you go. But we're just going to talk about it in basic terms. What's going on and what goes in and what comes out. So because plants can't move, they have to somehow produce their own sugar. Now humans, we can move. Other animals can move. So we don't have this ability because it's a really expensive process. It takes a lot of energy to make sugar, as you can imagine. It's not worth it for us because we can go get sugar. However, plants can't, so they've had to devote a huge part of their cellular processes to making food. So if you take a look here, this is a diagram of photosynthesis. Now, where is this happening? This is a chloroplast. So if you remember back to the beginning of the section, if you look over here, this is a plant cell, and there's not one chloroplast in one cell. There's many chloroplasts in one cell. And these chloroplasts are full of chlorophyll, which is the pigment which traps the sun's energy. And that's why they're green, right? Because they reflect green, but they absorb violet. They absorb red. And we spent some time talking about that. So if you take a look here, one thing I want you to notice, we're going to take a couple minutes here with this slide, and I want you to just look at what's going on. So this is happening inside the chloroplast. So this is in the chloroplast. The first thing I want you to notice is light. This is sunlight. So the top here is what goes in. So think of that equation that we used before. The reactants are carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Oops, excuse me. Carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight. Those are the three things that go in. What comes out is going to be sugar. So you can see down here, we have sugar and oxygen. So if you think back to that equation, water, carbon dioxide, light goes in, and then there's that arrow. Well, this is that arrow right here. This is all the stuff that happens in that arrow. That's the actual process that occurs, and then what you get as output, as the product, is you get your sugar and you get your oxygen. So one thing I want to point out to you is there's two steps to this process. There's what are called the light reactions, and then there's what's called the light independent or the Calvin cycle. And they are both important. Both of these processes have to occur in order to go through this thing we call photosynthesis. So I'm going to break it down into two parts. I'm going to explain the light reactions first, and then I'm going to explain the Calvin cycle. So let's go through this and see how we do. So the first thing we're going to talk about are the light reactions. So if you take a look here, these are the light reactions. This is what I would consider the battery charger. So just like everything, energy is required, right? If you want to use your cell phone, the battery needs to be charged. When your battery is dead, you don't throw away your cell phone, right? You just plug it back in and you recharge it. So I want you to think of the Calvin cycle as the actual thing that's doing the work in photosynthesis. This process here is what makes sugar. But if this over here didn't happen, there wouldn't be any energy to make the sugar. So there's a couple things I want to point out to you. Down here, there are two molecules. One is called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate, which I've mentioned before. And the other is this complex molecule NADPH, which is what we consider an electron carrier. So think of these as charged batteries. These two here are being charged by this process. So sunlight comes in and it charges ATP and NADPH to go and provide the energy needed for the Calvin cycle. And then for here, you can see the dead batteries or the used batteries are going to go back into the light reactions to make that happen. So let's talk about the light reactions a little bit. Okay, so what are these processes? So the first one we're talking about are the light reactions or light dependent. They're called the light dependent reactions because they depend on light. If the sun went out, this wouldn't happen. Where does it happen? It happens in the grana, so those stacks of thylakoids. So if you remember back to the chloroplast, we have our thylakoids and we have our stroma, which is the liquid around the thylakoids. So these take place in the grana. The three things that you need are sunlight, water, and chlorophyll. Those are the three substances that you need. Water goes in, light goes in, and chlorophyll needs to be there because chlorophyll is what actually traps the energy, right? So it uses the energy to convert ADP and NADP+, which are the uncharged batteries, into ATP and NADPH, which are the charged batteries. So I'm not going to go into great detail about how that happens. All you need to know is that ADP and NADP+ are like your cell phone when the battery's like almost dead and your cell phone won't work anymore. So this process charges those batteries. It turns ADP into ATP by adding a phosphate, and we'll talk more about that later on. Di means 2, tri means 3. So adenosine diphosphate has 2 phosphates on it, and adenosine triphosphate has 3. And then NADPH is going to be formed from NADP. So a hydrogen gets added to it, and these are charged batteries. So what comes out of this process? Well, you get 3 products from the light reactions. You get 1 ATP gets made, you get 2 NADPH, and you get oxygen. So oxygen gets given off as a byproduct. The plants don't need oxygen, but for us it's so important, right? So that's what actually provides oxygen. So that is why, if you think back to the Ingenhousz experiment, the plant didn't make oxygen when the light was out, right? So that mouse died when the light was out. The only time the mouse survived was when the light was on. And that's because this process can only take place when light is on, because it needs the light, and this is when the oxygen gets made. So if I go back to my diagram here, you can see the water comes in from the roots, light comes in from the sun, chlorophyll traps that energy, and it produces ATP and NADPH from NADP and ADP. So essentially it's charging these batteries so they can be used in the Calvin cycle. And you get oxygen as a byproduct. The plants don't care about the oxygen, we obviously do. And the second part of this process is called the Calvin cycle, also called the light-independent reactions, because these don't need sunlight. So this process can actually happen at night. But because it happens in the day and the night, they used to call them the dark reactions, but they don't really call them the dark reactions anymore because they don't just happen in the dark. But they're called the light-independent reactions, or the Calvin cycle, because a gentleman by the name of Calvin, his last name is Calvin, he discovered it. And this happens in the stroma. So this is not in the thylakoids. This is in the liquid outside of the thylakoids. And what happens here is ATP and NADPH from the sun, from those light reactions, the battery charger, they provide the energy needed to make glucose. So basically carbon dioxide comes in and it gets used to make glucose. So you use one molecule, one molecule, I should say, of glucose is made by 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, and that makes 1 carbon sugar. And this sugar is done, 2 things are done with the sugar. One is it gets used immediately to make the plant run, right? Because the plant needs energy. Or it gets stored for later in the form of cellulose or starch. And what do? We come along and we eat it, right? So this whole process has 2 parts to it. So I'm going to go back to my diagram just to make sure we all understand. So let's look at what the product is. We have glucose, C6H12O6, or if I reduce it down, it's CH2O. Where does the carbon come from? Well, the carbon comes from carbon dioxide, right? So the CO2 coming in from the air provides the carbon. Where does the hydrogen come from? Well, the hydrogen comes from the water that got absorbed and then carried over with the charged battery with NADP. So if you look here, it's NADP+, and then it picks up a hydrogen, and that hydrogen is what allows this process to continue. And then where does the oxygen come from? The carbon dioxide. And then oxygen gets given off as a byproduct here. So this whole process is pretty amazing. You got stuff coming in, you got stuff coming out. The products are going to be oxygen gets given off and sugar gets given off. The whole point of this process is to make sugar. And what goes in? Sunlight, water, and carbon dioxide. I'm going to finish up by just one more time just explaining this process in terms of how I think of it. I like to tell my students where it says light reactions, I want you to write down the word battery charger. The job of the light reactions is they charge the batteries. If the batteries die, this whole process ends. So is this an important part of everything? Of course it is. If this doesn't continue to work, if the sun stops shining, we stop making ATP and NADPH, and this process can't occur. So the light reactions are the battery charger. The Calvin cycle is the sugar maker. This is what actually makes the sugar. It takes carbon dioxide, it takes hydrogen, and it uses those, basic components to make sugar. And then the plant either uses that energy or it gives it off and or it stores it, I should say, in the form of starch or cellulose, and then we come along and we eat it. Thank you very much.